All right, so my talk today is titled Hello Girls on Strike, the Federal Government, Southwestern Bell Company, and the Strike That Turned Fort Smith Upside Down. This is a small part of my master's thesis that I will be working on in the next semester to kind of broaden it out and talk about several different issues that happened during this time, but today's talk will focus primarily on the strike. On December 27th, 1917, citizens of Fort Smith heard the words, "Number please," for the first time since September 22nd, as the telephone operators for the Southwestern Bell Company in Fort Smith, Arkansas, returned to their stations after an almost 4-month strike against the Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. If the strike had not produced chaos enough, Fort Smith citizens also endured the indictments of their mayor and their chief of police during the course of the strike, creating months of trials and removals from office and enduring an unexpected election. The election was notable in itself due to recent legislation in Arkansas, allowing Arkansas women to vote in primary elections, and thus these Fort Smith women were the first women in the South to vote, 2 years prior to the 19th Amendment. In the end, the strike lasted so long, created so much unrest, and spread so wide that federal officials had no choice but to step in and end the strike. This intervention appears to be one of the few times that federal government did step in with telephone operators, and the length and character of the strike had much to do with this interference. Additionally, the strike took place just 5 short months after the U.S. declaration of war on Germany drew the United States into World War I. Amidst entering into a world war, the United States government also encountered a significant amount of labor disputes across the nation, such as the Bisbee copper mine strike in Arizona. While the government quickly intervened in Arizona to end the copper strike, officials observed the Fort Smith strike and allowed state mediation for as long as possible. Moreover, the telephone operator strike is another in the history of labor disputes that led to Woodrow Wilson's formation of the National War Labor Board in April of 1918, and the onset of stronger federal intervention in labor dealings between employers and employees. The 1917 Fort Smith telephone operator strike completely turned Fort Smith, Arkansas upside down and is crucial to the history of labor disputes in the 20th century, but has consistently been overlooked by historians. This article is an attempt to display the magnitude and importance of the strike and insert it into its rightful place in history. The historiography on this particular event is extremely limited. Stephen H. Norwood, a professor at the University of Arkansas, wrote a book titled Labor's Flaming Youth, Telephone Operators and Worker Militancy 1878 to 1923, which mentions the Fort Smith strike in a mere 5 paragraphs, in one chapter discussing state suppression of telephone operators and their unions. This is an important contribution as it appears to be the first mention of this particular strike in a scholarly work, but it leaves an incomplete and somewhat inaccurate analysis of the strike. Norwood argues the federal government immediately dispatched a Labor Department mediator to effect a settlement because they viewed this as a threat to the war effort. In reality, the federal government observed the strike from afar for several weeks before stepping in to arbitrate the strike. Additionally, Ben Bolden, a native of Little Rock, I believe, published Hidden History of Fort Smith, Arkansas, in which he briefly discussed the events of the Fort Smith strike between 2 chapters. His focus on this event, however, is limited to discussing the removal of the mayor from office that resulted in the first female votes in the South, and his discussion on the strike itself is limited to mentioning events surrounding the strike and that led to the indictment and removal of the mayor from office. Thus, his contribution to this event is significant and needed, yet it is incomplete in its analysis. Likewise, there are a few books that focus specifically on women telephone operators, their working conditions, and their unionization during this time period, but very few of these works mention Fort Smith or the 1917 strike. One such work is Carrie Seagrave's The Women Who Got America Talking, Early Telephone Operators, 1878 to 1922. Which includes 3 chapters discussing the evolution of female telephone operators, 2 chapters on the horrible treatment of the operators across the nation, and 1 chapter on strikes and unions regarding telephone operators, but never once mentions Fort Smith or Arkansas as a site of a prominent telephone operator strike. Furthermore, of the strikes she does mention in this chapter, the longest one I could find only lasted a few weeks, and I could not find one that she mentions that required federal mediation. What's important about this one is that this strike drug on for 4 months, so it was significantly longer than any of the ones that she mentioned, and it required federal mediation, but yet she still does not mention it. Finally, Valerie Jean Connors, the National War Labor Board, Stability, Social Justice, and the Voluntary State in World War I, details the pre-war relationship between the federal government and labor unions and the onset of federal intervention into labor dealings with the National War Labor Board. This book is important for its study because it shows how the federal government's interactions with labor disputes changed with the creation of the NWLB, where it went from allowing private mediation in labor disputes to federal intervention in these. So, how did the strike begin, and why did it develop into a 4-month ordeal, including a week-long general strike that effectively shut Fort Smith down? On September 11th, 1917, female telephone operators working at the Southwestern Bell Company met and organized their own union, the first of its kind in Arkansas. Most of these operators were between the ages of 15 and 19, mostly 16 and 17, according to a national federal investigation the Department of Labor conducted just a few years prior in 1910. Soon after the creation of the union, the company dismissed 2 girls from their employment because of their association with the union. Unfortunately, I don't have these girls' names. The primary sources that I use don't tell me the voices of the women. It is a sadly lacking part of this, and I'm trying with my further research to find these women's voices, but unfortunately I haven't found that yet. But after the dismissal of these 2 girls, the remaining girls walked out on September 19th after the company made it clear it was not going to reverse their decision. At first, the girls only had one demand: for the company to reinstate the dismissed girls, and by extension, they recognized the legitimacy of the union. What seemed like a simple demand only grew more complicated as the company continuously refused to meet for arbitration. In the beginning, the company attempted to use strike breakers to continue phone service throughout the area, but finally gave up all hopes of that and shut down all phone service on September 22nd. District managers of the Southwestern Bell Company also filed the first of many injunctions against several of the operators, including 2 names that I have been able to find through census records, Berta Moore and Ella McMahon. I don't know if those are the 2 girls that were originally dismissed or if they were just some unlucky people in the strike. The order enjoined these 2 women, along with other operators and townspeople, from preventing, and quote, from preventing any or attempting to prevent by force, violence, threats, or intimidations plaintiffs' employees or any of them or any other persons from entering or attempting to enter the plaintiff's said exchanges in Fort Smith and Van Buren, Arkansas, end quote. As a result of these injunctions, many of the operators testified against the company in court, and the horrific treatment, including harsh discipline and several instances of sexual harassment, they revealed in their opinions further solidified public opinion against the company and gave reason as to why the operators wanted to unionize in the first place. Public opinion was very favorable toward the strikers, and the local newspaper, the Southwest American, published many accounts of the public support, including a local theater donating some of their proceeds to the operators to help fund their cause. Moreover, the strikers enjoyed support from other unions and industries across the area, especially the coal miners' unions, almost from the beginning of the strike. On September 30th, some of the striking women visited a coal camp, riding in decorated cars, and supporters lined the streets on the way from Fort Smith to the coal camp, showing their support. The Trade Labor Council also met that same day on September 30th to discuss the strike and pledge their support to the operators. Finally, the business people in Fort Smith quickly tried to bring mediation between the strikers and the company in an effort to restore phone service, but the company continuously was unwilling to make any concessions for the operators. Unfortunately, public opinion could not sway the leaders' decisions, and the strike dragged on into October. Adding even more complications to the matter, the Fort Smith Times-Record, the other local newspaper at the time, reported on October 3rd that many of the town's leaders, including the mayor, J.H. Wright, and chief of police, Jim Fernandez, had been arrested for dealings with the strike on the order of District Judge Frank Humans. The indictment served against the mayor and the chief of police alleged they knew about riotous activity at the telephone company building, but did nothing to stop the gathering. Thus, they violated Fort Smith law. Over the rest of the month, the mayor and chief of police received several more indictments, leading to a trial. Both city newspapers were consumed with the mayor's trial and reported much more on that in October than they did about the strike itself. On October 13th, Mayor Wright was convicted of making pre-election promises, which violated Section 18 of a Provisions Act of city legislation enacted in February of 1913. This conviction eventually removed him from office. The result of his removal from office was an election for a new mayor that was decided by female voting in the very first primary that they could. While this story is beyond the scope of this article, the mayoral trial and election ended up eclipsing coverage of the strike in local newspaper, and the first indictments against the mayor had to do with his dealings regarding the strike. So these two events are intricately intertwined, and it is impossible to discuss one without the other. In the midst of the strike and trial afflicting Fort Smith, federal officials observed from afar, but allowed local and state governments to maintain control over the situation as long as possible. On September 30th, Samuel Gompers, the well-known president of the American Federation of Labor, received a telegram that detailed the situation along with the willingness of the operators to submit to arbitration. Gompers passed the letter on to the U.S. Attorney General Thomas W. Gregory on October 2nd and asked him to allow the Fort Smith police to maintain authority over the situation and refrain from sending federal guards on request from the telephone company. On October 6th, Gregory responds to Gompers stating that the Department of Justice would not get involved at that time. It would not do so until it was clear that litigation at the Arkansas level was not successful. Even though the United States had just entered into World War I, the federal government was not immediately entering into labor disputes to return strikers at this time. They instead allowed local governments and district courts to litigate the situation and only stepped in once these avenues failed. As the Department of Justice observed Fort Smith from Washington, telephone operator strikes spread into the surrounding areas, including Bartlesville, Sapulpa, and Spiro, Oklahoma, and Springfield, Missouri. While it is unclear, according to newspaper sources, if these strikes were inspired by the Fort Smith strike itself or simply happened in tandem, the spread of such strikes shows the magnitude of the situation in the region. Despite war efforts across the nation, telephone operator strikes continued to spread in the region. On October 4th, with rising tensions across the region, an investigator from the Department of Labor arrived in Fort Smith to keep an eye on the situation. Members of the different labor unions in the area sent the same telegram to William B. Wilson, the Secretary of Labor, as they did to Samuel Gompers, detailing the working conditions inside the telephone company and the current status of the strike. On October 2nd, the assistant to Secretary Wilson had Joseph Myers, a member of the Conciliation Division, travel to Fort Smith on behalf of the division to investigate the situation. Myers proceeded to Fort Smith and attempted to help mediate a settlement to the strike, but on October 15th, he wrote to Hugh Kerwin, the assistant to the Secretary of Labor, expressing how serious the situation was, and though he hoped that he could reach a conclusion in a few days. At this time, Arkansas Governor Charles Brough even offered to mediate the phone strike, but the representatives of Southwestern Bell Company again refused to comply, saying it had nothing to discuss with him. 5 days later, Myers sent another telegram to Kerwin detailing the indictments of Mayor Wright and the chief of police, while expressing concern over the possibility of violence and the company's refusal to allow state-led arbitration. This telegram shows while the Department of Labor was in Fort Smith monitoring the strike, their investigators still attempted to allow local and state level mediation to run its course before calling in federal assistance on October 20th. While Myers had not officially stepped in to take over mediation during this time, he often acted on behalf of the phone operators and urged the company to comply with requests for higher wages, the reinstatement of the girls that were dismissed, and so on. Around this time, it became clear within the newspapers that the initial one demand of the strikers had expanded to include these better wages and working conditions alongside recognition of the union and reinstatement of the dismissed girls. Due to recent public knowledge of the harsh working conditions, they realized they had public support to continue asking for more things. As the days lingered on, the resolve of the girls only strengthened. At the end of October, the federal conciliator, Joseph Myers, left to work on the copper mine strike in Bisbee, Arizona, and the Secretary of Labor, alongside the Secretary of Labor, and left arbitration in the hands of Governor Brough. Perhaps one of the reasons federal officials were reluctant to step in and arbitrate the Fort Smith strike is because they were further occupied with the Bisbee copper mine strike in Arizona. The copper mine strike took place over the same time as the Fort Smith strike, but was a matter of much higher national priority, as copper was essential to making weapons for the war effort, whereas telephones in Fort Smith were not quite as high on the war priority list. The Arizona strike, moreover, experienced much more violence between the company, local officials, and the strikers than the telephone strike in Fort Smith did. Because of this, federal arbitrators focused primarily on Arizona, dividing their time between there and Fort Smith, while they allowed state officials to continue to attempt to mediate the telephone strike. The arbitration was unsuccessful, though, and the strike continued into its third month. November saw no change in the attitude of the telephone company, the representatives who were keener on obtaining federal guards from the Department of Justice than they were on agreeing to arbitration and ending the strike itself. Still, the striking operators pushed for compromise and mediation, even after being repeatedly told there was no point in meeting because of the unwilling company executives. With no desire at all to submit to arbitration, the Southwestern Bell Company took to garnering public support for their cause through advertisements published in the newspapers, explaining their side while pointing fingers at their opposition. These advertisements, published primarily by the Fort Smith Times-Record, and I'll explain why in a little bit, stated the company reserved, quote, the right to employ and discharge employees as it finds necessary, end quote, and, quote, the rules of the company provide that any discharged or dissatisfied employee has the right of appeal to the higher officials of the company, where they will receive full justice to the best of our abilities, end quote. Additionally, the company fought against the accusations of harsh working conditions by publishing a half-page statement of facts that detailed the operators received $8.21 per week for a 6-day work week, consisting of 8-hour days with 30-minute breaks each day and vacation time during the summer months. While these working conditions might not have seemed very harsh, the advertisement does not mention anything about the severe physical discipline these girls faced while working for the company. Meanwhile, the operators continued their strike, pushed for mediation, and submitted plan after plan for arbitration. While the strikers and telephone company executives were at a standoff, the election for the new Fort Smith mayor was quickly approaching. J.H. Wright, strangely enough, could run for his own position from which he was removed, even though it was a removal by a conviction of jury. The Democratic primary election took place on November 13, 1917. Arch Monroe defeated J.H. Wright and went on to run unopposed in the general election ticket, thus solidifying his victory as the new mayor of Fort Smith. By the end of November, the strike situation seemed so hopeless and had lasted so long that the acting mayor created a special strike commission to investigate and attempt to bring an end to the strike. Still, the phone company refused to negotiate, and the strike continued on into its fourth month. With no end in sight for the telephone strike, support from other labor unions in the area was at an all-time high. So much so that representatives of 25 organized unions, including the Union of the Fort Smith Light and Traction Company, Railroad Laborers and Machinists, and the Stagehands Union, talked of a general strike at the beginning of December. Several meetings were held between labor unions and the city government to avoid the general strike and also end the operator's strike, but again, nothing was resolved. Thus, members of labor unions across the area walked out of their jobs on December 8, 1917, demanding recognition of the telephone union, and did not return to their posts until December 15th. During this time, the city was without electricity, coal, phone service, or newspapers, and the entire city effectively shut down for a week. This general strike brought about the first direct arbitration attempts from the federal government, which ended the strike company by company, on the condition of federal intervention in the settlement of the telephone strike, before turning its entire focus on the Southwestern Bell strike. Federal conciliators focused on returning the most important services, such as electricity and coal, to work before attempting to arbitrate the initial cause for the general strike. In response to a request from Joseph Myers for help, Robert B. Keating, a commissioner of conciliation, traveled to Fort Smith alongside his fellow arbitrator Mark L. Crawford to mediate this general strike. They focused on each individual strike, starting with the Fort Smith Power Company, and worked their way through the different unions until they reported to the Secretary of Labor on December 15th that all striking workmen were back on the job except for the telephone operators. However, as late as December 10th, Keating wrote in a telegram that he was concerned about the intensifying situation in Fort Smith and was considering calling the state commissioner of labor regarding the strike, indicating he still felt the need for state intervention rather than federal intervention in resolving this situation. In the end, however, it became clear that state arbitration was never going to be successful, and Keating stepped in to take full control of arbitration and mediation attempts. Throughout December, telephone operators did not get much news coverage, perhaps due to the general strike, or perhaps due to the fact that after 4 months, newspapers just didn't want to report on the unchanging strike. But these newspapers did gleefully report on the end of the strike on December 27, 1917. Correspondences between labor officials show the girls agreed to return to work without receiving any concessions from the telephone company, on the promise of continued negotiations between federal officials and the Southwestern Bell executives. But these negotiations, just like throughout the rest of the strike before that, proved fruitless, and the operators did not receive any of their demands. Thus, a nearly 4-month strike, wrought with complications such as indictments of city officials, widespread strikes across 3 states, federal intervention, and the first Southern female votes, ended. In the end, Robert Keating, on behalf of the federal government, helped end the strike by meeting with labor leaders, where the strikers agreed to return to work, while Keating promised to follow up with the telephone company and meet with them about higher wages, reinstating the 2 operators. But interestingly, Keating never gave any concession or any promise of getting company recognition of the union, which, if you'll remember, was why the girls walked out in the first place. Keating stated after the strike ended that he still worried about a general strike breaking out again, but that he, quote, certainly had worked hard on this case and accomplished something that the governor of the state and his entire staff failed to accomplish, end quote. Furthermore, he asserted that, quote, the department has received more credit throughout the entire Southwest in the settlement of this long, drawn-out controversy than through anything else it has recently accomplished, end quote. Now, if you'll remember, they just ended a huge strike in Arizona in the Southwest with the International Workers of the World. And so it was interesting to see how he thinks this is getting more attention than that did. But not only did the federal government manage to end the telephone strike, but the efforts and results of the mediation were known throughout the region. It's even mentioned in the American Federationist, which was the American Federation of Labor's official magazine. It appears that many people across the United States at the time knew about and discussed an event that would soon be lost to history and hardly discussed at all, even in the town it occurred in. Keating's confidence in his accomplishments would not age well. Transcripts of a 1918 executive board of the State Federation of Labor hearing describes how none of the promises for better wages or operators' reinstatements Keating had made to the strikers and labor leaders to end the strike ever came to fruition. In a 40-page document, labor leaders resolved that Keating had had no authority to end the strike, did not report on his progress of mediation with the telephone company, and simply did nothing that he had agreed to do. Keating, in contrast, maintained he attempted several times to contact Mr. Vedder, who was the district manager of the Southwestern Bell Company, to advocate for the reinstatement of the fired operators, but never received any response and thus could go no further with his negotiations. As a result, the operators did not gain any successes from their strike at all. The entire 4 months, they ended exactly where they started. Throughout the entirety of the strike, the telephone operators survived on public support. Many individuals and businesses gave monetary support, and businessmen stepped in time and again to help arbitrate the strike. Even the 2 local newspapers, the Southwest American and the Fort Smith Times-Record, were extremely vocal on their opinion of the strike, but they were on complete opposite sides of the fray. From almost the very beginning, it was clear the Southwest American was sympathetic to the striking operators, while the Fort Smith Times-Record held the strikers at fault for the inability to place phone calls throughout the city and the lengthy duration of the strike. The Times-Record even vehemently attacked the Southwest American several times for their support of the operators, instead of denouncing the reluctance of the Southwestern Bell Company. On September 21st, the Southwest American ran a story on the U.S. District Court approving a restraining order on the striking telephone operators, barring them from preventing any employee, manager, or strikebreaker from entering the building. In a side commentary, the newspaper condemned the telephone company for not recognizing the union, citing its hypocrisy in that, quote, "While the company may maintain an organization that reaches coast to coast and creates a monopoly of a great utility, the girls who serve them and the public may not join together for their mutual welfare and betterment," end quote. Furthermore, the Southwest American continuously showed support for the girls by running stories of the ongoing public support, petitions for monetary donations for the strikers, and through their word choices in their headlines and stories. On October 2nd, the newspaper ran a story about the girls receiving support from individuals in Huntington under the headline, "Girls Strikers Are Entertained at Huntington," effectively giving the illusion that the girls were taking a day trip out of town to visit friends rather than gaining support for a region-wide strike. The paper even ran a headline above their title on November 12th, giving support to Mayor Wright and denouncing a meeting of townspeople called to create a law enforcement committee to bring order back to the city. It states, "The big drive is on tomorrow between the few who started all this ruckus in Fort Smith and the many who were satisfied with Mayor Wright's administration before the disturbers got busy with their Iron Cross, anarchy, law enforcement shams, and advertised this good city to the world as a lawless, intolerable place when not a blow had been struck or an act of actual violence committed." Although it appears the headline was addressing all supporters of the Law Enforcement Committee, this is an attack directed at the Times-Record, the other local newspaper, as that newspaper had long been printing condemnations of the strike, alluding to the strikers and supporters of the mayor as German sympathizers, and bemoaning Fort Smith as a victim of anarchy and in desperate need of law and order. The Fort Smith Times-Record, on the other hand, appeared impartial toward the beginning of this strike, but soon lost all appearances of objectivity and began denouncing the strikers and the Southwest American for its support. On September 30th, the Times-Record ran a story describing the court proceedings over the strike and essentially compared the mayor and the chief of police to the Germans the United States was fighting at that very moment. Lots of Iron Cross and all of those terminology used during this time. Later, it condemned calls for an independent telephone service calling for the city to end the strike and return the Southwestern Bell Exchange to operation. It was not long until the Times-Record turned its sights on the Southwest American for its support of the striking girls. After several days of describing the city as rife with anarchy and needing a law enforcement league, the Times-Record attacked the Southwest American, comparing its editor to Fido begging for a bone and asking for cooperation from the league when the editor realized how great of a support the league had from the townspeople. If one questions why the strike could possibly have lasted for almost 4 months without any sort of successful mediation during that time, one only has to look at the bitter divide between the newspapers to see just how complicated the strike was. With the newspapers so fervently opposed to one another, it is easy to see how stark the lines between the Southwestern Bell Company and the operators were. Neither side, whether company executives or striking operators, nor the Times-Record or the Southwest American, were willing to give even an inch to see the other side's point of view and offer any sort of compromise on the issue. The Fort Smith telephone operator strike was an extremely important issue not only in Arkansas but also across the South and within women's labor movements, but it is rarely discussed today. Over the course of the 4 months, these women's requests for arbitration went unanswered. State and local governments tried over and over to mediate, but were also met with only silence from the company. Newspapers were divided on opinions of the strikers, and the company ran vitriol-filled stories. Still, the women persisted and garnered enough resolve and support to maintain the strike from September to December, one of the longest in the history of telephone operators. Not only had the women suffered before and during their strike, but the entire city of Fort Smith was upended because of the situation. The city was without telephone service for almost 4 months and had to live in constant fear of fire danger without the ability to call for help. Business was disrupted, and the telephone company was uninterested in bending the smallest bit to help bring phone service back to them. Furthermore, courts indicted the mayor and chief of police, resulting in their trial and conviction and forcing an unexpected election. This election saw major changes in that women participated for the first time and ended up being the deciding factor on the mayoral candidate on the official ballot. This alone made the strike historically significant because women were voting for elected officials in the South 2 years prior to the 19th Amendment. And finally, the city accepted federal interference to bring an end to the strike only after it survived a week-long general strike that plunged its citizens into darkness with no light, heat, news, or phones. Fort Smith is not a city most would think of when imagining a large labor strike. In 1917, it only had a population of 28,870, far smaller than Chicago during the garment workers' strike of 1910 or the later steel strike in 1919. And the Fort Smith strike did not take place during the summer of unrest in 1919 like the steel strike in Chicago. In light of this, it is easy to understand how scholars overlooked the strike over the years, relegating it to small mentions in chapters of books. However, the strike brought a lot of change not only to Fort Smith, Arkansas and the South, but brought national attention and federal intervention. This strike changed Fort Smith in obvious ways, but also changed the South by ushering in these female votes and by showing the strength and resolve of women workers. All of this occurred 2 years prior to the national experiences of labor unrest and the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment in the summer of 1919. Additionally, the federal intervention preceded the creation of the National War Labor Board and changing policies regarding private versus federal mediation of labor disputes. Therefore, the 1917 strike between Fort Smith female telephone operators and the Southwestern Bell Company is so vital to labor history in the early 20th century and needs to be brought out of the shadows and placed into mainstream historiography. Thank you.